All right, so welcome to another deep dive, everyone. Today we are diving into some pretty significant changes we've been seeing in the Russia-Ukraine war. Our main source for this is a Newsweek article, actually just came out on December 2nd this year. It's titled "Russia Seizes Ukraine Territory the Size of Singapore." I mean, the title kind of says it all, doesn't it? Russia has made, well, some pretty big gains in territory just this past November. The biggest, actually, since the war began. We're talking an area bigger than Singapore. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. So to help us unpack all of this, we brought in our expert. Can you give us like the rundown? How much territory are we actually talking here?
Yeah, you're right. This is a pretty big deal. These are some of the most significant developments we've seen in a while. So according to the article, Russia took over 725 square kilometers in November. Just November. To put that in perspective, that's, well, imagine a landmass like the size of New York City just suddenly changing hands. And this actually is even more than what they gained back in October, which at the time we thought those were the biggest gains in over 2 years.
Okay, so wow, that's a lot to take in. It feels like things have been kind of static on the ground, for a while now. So this feels like a pretty big shift. So how does this compare to, like all of Russia's gains since the beginning of the war?
Well, it's important to remember that, territory has kind of gone back and forth throughout the whole conflict. Like early on, right after the invasion back in March of 2022, Russia took a massive amount of territory, over 45,000 square kilometers. That's, larger than the entire country of Denmark, just to give you a visual. But since about spring of 2024, we've seen this kind of gradual increase in Russian advances, and they've gained over 3,500 square kilometers this year alone, which is it's actually 6 times more than what they gained in all of 2023.
Wait, 6 times? That's incredible. These numbers are huge. And I mean, what does this even mean for the people living in these areas, especially like in the Donetsk region? That seems to be like a focal point, right?
Yeah, the situation in Donetsk is it's definitely something to watch closely. Ukrainian control there has shrunk to less than a third by the end of November. The beginning of the year, they still held about 40%. So you can see there's been a significant shift in control there.
Yeah, that's a pretty sobering thought. And the article also mentioned some expert opinions on what we might see happening in the coming months. Anything that like stood out to you?
Well, there's one prediction that I thought was particularly striking. It came from Emil Kastahelmi. He's a military analyst with the Finnish-based Blackbird Group. And, he suggested that the coming months, especially through the winter, are going to be very difficult for Ukraine. He actually said, and I quote, "The trend is very worrying, and there's no reason to expect the situation to calm down in December either."
That's a that's a pretty bleak assessment. But even with these advances, the article also highlighted some pretty significant losses on the Russian side too. Can you talk about that a little?
You're absolutely right. Even with all these gains, the cost for Russia has been huge,
Mm.
according to data from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. Russian casualties had a record high at the end of November. Over 2,000 troops lost in just one day. This number actually broke a previous record, which was set just a few weeks earlier.
Wow, that's a lot. 2,000 in one day. That really kind of highlights the just the ferocity of the fighting there. Even with, Russia making these gains. I'm wondering like what could be driving these kind of sudden surges by Russia? The article mentioned something about Donetsk.
Yeah, you've hit on something important there. The article, it doesn't really go into a ton of detail, but it does kind of suggest that Russia's gains, the recent ones,
Yeah.
are probably tied to like a change in their strategy. It seems like they're really focused on securing the Donetsk region, even if it means sustaining a lot of losses to do it.
So it's like a calculated risk for them. Are they hoping to like gain a better negotiating position by controlling more territory, even if, it costs them a lot to do it?
Yeah, that's definitely one possible explanation. By focusing on Donetsk, they might be trying to create a situation where they can, kind of dictate the terms of any future peace talks.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. But it still feels like there's like more going on, like under the surface. You mentioned earlier that like the situation in Russia domestically is something to watch closely. Can you talk about that a little more? I'm really curious about like how things are going for them back home.
Yeah, that's an important point, and one that the article really only kind of touches on. There's no doubt that the war has had a, well, a big impact on Russia's economy, and it's putting a strain on public opinion too. The sanctions that Western countries have put in place, combined with the rising costs of the war, it's definitely taking its toll.
And I imagine those mounting casualties we talked about, those aren't helping either. It's going to be putting a ton of pressure on the government, right?
Absolutely. And while there hasn't been like any widespread outcry against the war, there's a growing sense of unease. There are reports of protests, mainly from well, mothers and wives of soldiers who have been killed or captured.
That's heartbreaking. It really highlights the human cost of all this, you know. It's easy to get caught up in all the geopolitical stuff and forget about the people, the individuals.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We can't lose sight of that. And all these internal pressures within Russia, those could actually have a real impact on how this conflict ends up playing out. If the economy keeps getting worse and if there's more and more dissent, it could force the Russian government to reconsider their strategy.
So basically, we're watching like two battles here. One on the ground in Ukraine and then another one inside Russia.
Exactly. And understanding how those two things are connected, that's key to understanding how complex all of this is.
Yeah, this is giving me a much better sense of the big picture. We've talked about, Russia's perspective and all of the pressures they're facing, but what about Ukraine? How are they holding up?
Well, despite these recent setbacks, Ukraine has shown, incredible resilience. They've managed to hold off an army that's, much bigger and better equipped for over 2 years now. Their resistance has been helped by all the military aid they've gotten from Western countries, which has kind of helped to even the playing field a bit.
But with these recent losses and the prediction that things could get even tougher, what options do they even have at this point?
Well, their main goal right now is to try to install the Russian advance
Mm-hmm.
and to prevent any more big losses of territory. They're also hoping to launch a counteroffensive in the spring when the weather's better to try and take back some of the ground they've lost.
That sounds pretty risky.
It is, and it'll depend a lot on continued support from the West, both military aid and economic assistance.
So it seems like the international community has a pretty big role to play in all this.
Absolutely, the decisions that Western powers make, and Russia's internal situation and how determined Ukraine is, all of those will factor into how this all plays out.
It's a lot to keep track of, but I think having all this context, it really helps to make sense of what we're seeing in the news. It's not just about who controls what territory or how many casualties there are. It's about it's about politics and economics and the human cost of war. So, given everything we've talked about, where do we go from here? Like, what are the chances of this conflict actually getting resolved?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, if we're being honest, predicting the future of this war, it's almost impossible. But
Sure.
I guess we can look at some possible scenarios, keeping in mind all the stuff we've been talking about.
Yeah. Okay. So what are some of the potential outcomes here?
Well, one possibility, and it seems pretty unlikely right now, I'll admit, is some kind of negotiated settlement. But for that to happen, both sides would have to give up some pretty big things, and neither side seems particularly willing to do that right now. Especially with Russia's recent gains, they might actually feel like they can push for even more.
Yeah, that seems like a long shot, especially with the fighting getting worse as we head into winter. So what else could happen?
Another possibility, and this one is it's maybe the most worrying one, is that we end up with a prolonged stalemate.
Mm.
Where neither side can win, and the fighting just drags on and on for years. That would be it'd be devastating for both Ukraine and Russia. More deaths, economic hardship, political instability.
Yeah, that's a pretty grim thought. A war with no end in sight. It's hard to even imagine what that would do to people. So are there any other scenarios we should be thinking about?
Well, there's always the wild card of someone else getting involved, but that comes with its own risks, of course. More military aid from Western countries could help Ukraine, shore up their defenses.
Yeah.
And maybe even shift the balance of power. But it also risks, making the conflict worse, and maybe even drawing other countries into the fighting.
Yeah, it's a tough situation trying to provide support without starting a bigger war. The stakes are feels like they're just getting higher and higher.
They are. And it's important to remember that things are changing all the time. Anything we say now, about what might happen,
Yeah,
could all change tomorrow.
that's true. So much is still uncertain. But I think this depth dive has really helped me,
Hmm.
to understand how complex all of this is. It's not just about lines on a map. It's about it's about internal pressures and international alliances and the human cost of war.
I agree. It's important to look beyond the headlines, and think about all these different factors when we're trying to understand this conflict.
Absolutely. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from Russia's gains to to what might happen next, and the human cost, which we can't forget about. I think we've done a good job of unpacking some of the key issues here.
Yeah, we've explored a lot, and it's clear that this is far from over.
Right. And while we may not have all the answers, I hope this deep dive has helped our listeners understand things a little better. So as we continue to follow this, and as things keep developing, I want to leave you with a question. What do you think the next 6 months hold for Ukraine and Russia? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll keep an eye on things, and we encourage you to stay informed too. Until next time.